To welcome everyone to the first Disability is Diversity Book Club session. This book club is brought to you by the Docs With Disabilities Initiative in partnership with the HED. The initiative uses research, education, and sharing of stories to drive change in healthcare education with an overall aim to build more inclusive educational environments for trainees with disabilities and increase representation of disabled providers in the healthcare workforce. The goal of Disability is Diversity Book Club is to introduce varied perspectives and encourage empathy for all stakeholders in a health science setting. Together, we will work through the multiple cases, empowering DRPs or disability resource professionals with varied perspectives and resources that boost your confidence to work through complex situations. I'm Grace Clifford, and I'm the Director for Disability Services at the Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, as well as a lead instructor and co-curriculum designer for the Docs With Disabilities Initiative, the Disability Resource Provider Academy. My counterpart, Nahm, and I are excited to be here with you today, and thank you for choosing to spend the next hour with us. Today's session will be recorded, and at the end of the case debrief, there'll be time for Q&A, at which point we'll end the recording to encourage further discussion. We encourage you to participate as we all learn from one another. Welcome. All right, I already introduced myself, but I will turn it over to Nahm so she can introduce herself.
Thank you, Grace. Yes, hello everyone. I'm Nahm. I'm the Director of Academic Support at the Geffen School of Medicine, and I actually work with Grace. I'm very honored to be here and co-host the session. I've been at UCLA for about 8 years and provide academic support, programming and resources to students at all stages of their medical career.
So we like to start by thanking all the contributing authors to the Disability is Diversity's casebook that are listed here. You know, without them, we would not have this amazing casebook to debrief on today. So we'd like to take that opportunity to thank them for their work. Similarly, we like to note that case one that we'll be talking about today, which is a student with a learning disability, was written by Dr. Christina H. Peterson, Stacy C. Jones, and Dr. Lisa Meeks. Some reminders as we start this session today. You know, this is a space for learning and connecting. No one has all the answers, not even Sue and myself. So questions are welcome at all levels. We're all here to learn and grow and kind of connect. We ask that you remember to be mindful of your contribution time to ensure other opportunities for other individuals to share. This is not a space for individual or group consultation regarding your current student situation. So we ask for more global questions, and we ask you to remember to navigate this space with humility and respect. If you want to engage in the discussion, raise your virtual Zoom hands, and either Sue or myself will unmute you. We have some content that we'll go over first, and then we'll turn it over to the discussion and debrief section. So in terms of the format and the agenda for today, we'll start by reviewing the key points of the case history. So the case one, the student with a learning disability, we're going to look at it from the perspectives of the student, from the medical school, and the disability resource provider. There's some guided questions that we will use to kind of create the discussion today, and then we'll turn it over for the questions and answer period. All right, I'll turn it over to Sue to talk about key points of case history for Clarissa.
Thank you, Grace. Yeah, so it's totally fine if you haven't actually read the chapter, but we're pulling for the key points from chapter 1 that cover a medical student. And these are actually based on actual cases. So we have, of course, the names have changed in some of the circumstances, but we're hoping this will be instructive for you as you think about navigating your own situations with students with disabilities. So let's go over the case with Clarissa. And the main points here are that she's a third-year medical student who just started her clinical clerkships. She was diagnosed in medical school with deficits in written and verbal language processing. She was also diagnosed with ADHD. And accommodations she's received to date while in medical school are time and a half on examinations, a reduced distraction environment, use of text-to-speech programs in her preclinical courses. And after implementing accommodations, it should be noted that her academic performance increased significantly. Next slide. In terms of her background, the case covers in depth the fact that she's from a low-income family, and as a result, she's expressed feeling a sense of otherness from her med school counterparts. Her clinical performance, now that she's started, patients and attendings say that they appreciate her calm demeanor, advocacy, and people skills, but she struggles with time management, prioritization, and finishing notes in a timely manner. So in terms of challenges, she takes longer than her peers to complete clinical work, and as a result, it leaves little time for her to prepare for her shelf exams. Next slide. Now, the concerns that have been expressed since she started her clerkships is that the attendings notice that Clarissa has been struggling to manage her duties on her rotations. They're also worried about her self-care, so her sleeping habits, whether she's eating healthily, maintaining her mental health and well-being, especially because she's spending longer hours trying to, finish up her duties after her official hours are over. Her clerkship director has tried to approach her about these concerns, but Clarissa doesn't really feel comfortable divulging personal details about her disability to a faculty member because they're in an evaluative position. And it should be noted that the institution has not designated a DRP or disability resource provider with specific knowledge of disabilities, current assistive technologies, and clinical accommodations. Next slide. So from the perspective of the student, we're going to go through each of these just so you have a holistic perspective of what's going on. The clinical environment presents as very hectic, noisy, and distracting for Clarissa. And so that's contributing to an increased need for time for her to accomplish things like note-taking and chart review. In addition, she's struggling with executive functioning, disorganization, and where she has difficulty completing tasks, or she takes longer to complete them. She also has difficulty with focus, attention, and drowning out background noise. And because of these other difficulties, as mentioned before, she was diagnosed with slow reading and processing speed. She's slower at note-taking. She takes more time to review charts and write and review patient notes. And of course, as mentioned earlier, she takes more time to prepare for her shelf exams. So there's a lot going on with Clarissa. Let's take a look at the next. In addition to that, as mentioned before, she's, just the lack of protected time, whether real or perceived. She's just afraid to take that time or protected time for self-care appointments. So as a result, she isn't sleeping well, or she has a lack of sleep. She has increased anxiety, and she's also feeling vulnerable. She doesn't know how to address the situation or who to talk to. In discussing accommodations with a faculty member, we mentioned earlier, there's this fear of talking to someone in an evaluative position because, whether, again, imagined or real, there's a fear of being discriminated against due to a disability, the fear of being misunderstood, and also a fear of the potential negative impact on her grades, recommendations, and residency match options. Next slide. So from the perspective of a medical school, what they're seeing with Clarissa is that there's disorganization resulting in inefficiencies with managing patients, completing charts, carrying out her duties, her clinical duties in a timely manner. Other team members are having to take on additional responsibilities to make up that difference. And then supervisory clinicians are saying that they have to stay longer to allow time for the student to complete her duties. In addition to that, the student is presenting as if they have a lack of knowledge, since Clarissa is taking longer to complete tasks, and advisory clinicians are beginning to wonder if the student's knowledge base is deficient. At the same time, and maybe this has happened in situations that you've observed with students, it's presenting as if Clarissa potentially lacks professionalism, since she's not reaching out or approaching a supervisor to acknowledge her difficulties or challenges, or discussing a plan to improve these deficiencies.
And then I have the easy slide, the perspective of the DRP, which is none, because there isn't a specialized disability resource provider for this institution, which is, very, very common. Only about 9% of medical schools have identified disability providers with that sort of expertise. So in this case, the student affairs official in charge, or there was a student affairs official that was charged with accommodations and oversight over that process, which was really implementing just what was outlined in the neuropsychological report. So that also means that student affairs professional was receiving directly the students' documentation and information. But the neuropsychological report only addressed didactic setting needs and didn't speak to what needs might exist in the clinical area. All right, so kicking it off with question 1. Wanting to know what individuals' initial impressions are, their concerns, and thoughts on what can immediately be done to support this student. Let's see if I can. If there's someone that is interested in responding, we can just raise the virtual hand, or we can allow you to talk. Okay, I see Terry. All right, Terry, can you hear us okay?
Yes, and I'm unmuted.
Yes, perfect.
So my initial impressions is that what's done very commonly is that we think about the preclinical time and the exams, and we blank out, about the stuff that's going to be going on during the clinical years. And so a concern is that there's not someone designated, even if they don't have a disability person, but someone within MAEd to have a conversation with students ahead of time. There's going to be those individuals who know who have accommodations. Let's have a conversation with them early, so that some of these like shared examples could be given to the student and say, do you see if there's a need? Do you think you might need a need for this? I found that to be extremely helpful to have the conversation before the student even gets into the clinical setting. And the other part of it is that there seems to be an environment where if you're different, you don't belong. And it seems to be permeating beyond just the disability for the student to feel so many areas where she can't share what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. And something to point out, all of these cases in the case study book are based on real student examples, obviously de-identified, but so I think that's an important piece as we're considering this too. But I think that's 100% correct. Not having an identified person goes beyond just the ability to support that student in a really intentional way, but also someone to look ahead, and to ask guiding questions. One of the things we hear all the time is, students in clinical environments don't know what to ask for because chances are they've never been in a clinical environment before. So that's excellent. Other impressions and concerns or thoughts on what can immediately be done to start the support of this student? See a hand up or something.
Sarah, Sarah, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. My hesitation in responding initially is just this one is super overwhelming. I think there's clearly a lot of barriers for the student and not a whole lot of support on the school side. And so I was kind of sitting here just thinking about it, and there's a lot that needs to be done. I think in the immediate or to immediately support the student, I think there would need to be, addressing what are those specific accommodations. And I think there were a few in the book that seemed helpful in terms of making sure the student has dedicated space to do notes and maybe has the right technology to be able to organize and create good output for their notes. But I also get this kind of overwhelming impression that a lot of development needs to happen with faculty and with the school in general about, assessing what clinical accommodations are possible and really developing an understanding of equity in that, accommodations are not diluting the quality of the education, but really that the purpose here is to make sure that Clarissa and other students have access in the clinical space, and whether there's accommodations put into place that it doesn't alter the quality of the education. Because I think it seems like there's fear on her side of judgment from faculty, but also probably, I would assume, some resistance to alternate paths to the same end. So I just think it's a big one for sure, but also probably super, super common.
Yeah. And I think that's excellent in terms of, implementing some level of faculty, support and education, is one of the things, from the med school perspective. They mentioned, one of the assumptions or feelings they were getting was interpreting what they were seeing with the student as a lack of a robust fund of knowledge for the student, not thinking about some of these other life things that might be getting in the way of the student's ability to demonstrate their mastery of the material. Thanks, Sarah. All right, I see Tamara. Okay, you should be unmuted. Oh, no. Let's see. All right.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
My apologies for that delay, trying to do too many things at one time. So really quickly, when I read over the case study, one thing that stood out for me, piggybacking off of your comment about collaborating and partnering with the department or the instructors, is to have a conversation about the technical standards and the competencies that in this case that Clarissa is expected to be able to do. So that way conversation with the staff themselves, along with the student, can be facilitated collaboratively instead of in isolation, in order to effectively support that student. And oftentimes that's like a proactive measure of getting ahead before there presents a problem. So that was my suggestion and takeaway as far as an action step for Clarissa.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point as well. When you don't have a specialized disability resource provider for a health science program or a medical school, not every disability resource provider is going to be familiar with technical standards and how those interact with accommodations or how to navigate that interactive process, including those. So I think that's an absolutely excellent point. And also helping the student understand how to navigate that. Although meeting technical standards is with or without reasonable accommodation, a lot of students seem to miss that follow-up line and fear that by asking for accommodations, it somehow indicates that they are not able to meet the technical standards. Right.
Yeah, and we have some really great comments in the chat as well. So just reading through those.
Yeah, if you do you want to read some of those too?
Yeah, sure. I'm still actually processing as I'm reading. Sorry. Yeah, so it's interesting. So Joanne just mentioned it's not surprising that the psychologists only talked about the non-clinical setting, as they probably don't have a full understanding of the clinical setting. Oh, that's really a great point. It might be good to talk to the evaluator if possible. And that's a key part of this, right? Is, that difference between when students get into the clinical setting, how, accommodations that were provided prior to that during their didactics may, there's just a lot to have to navigate, a lot more complex. So having that conversation, and, for folks who aren't familiar with the demands and the requirements and the technical standards, as mentioned earlier, it's super important to kind of have that, interactive process and dialogue and to look at the circumstances of that specific student. So great point, Joanne. And I'll read out, and Grace, if you wanted to also comment. Oh yeah, Yes, affirming Joanne. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, okay. Sarah points out too, providers seem open to helping, but lack confidence or understanding of what needs and or accommodations might be beyond your standard in a didactic testing environment, right? So kind of building on that same idea.
Yeah. And before we move on to the next question, Sue, just because you're coming from a different area and academic support and a different lens, I'd love to know, before my position was created and there wasn't an identified disability resource professional in the medical school, what would an interaction with a student like this look like, or what would you have done?
Yeah, that's a great question, Grace. We were definitely floundering in this area, which is why we're so happy to have you with us, providing your expertise and guidance. We do have a central, as you know, because thankfully we have a central office, a Center for Accessible Education, that provides and adjudicates and guides students through that process of seeking out and then approving accommodations. So prior to coming, typically what would happen is students would meet with me, or they would meet with their society dean. So we have a group of advisors that students are kind of assigned to work with from the very beginning to seek out any support for needs that they're having or difficulties or challenges. So whether they met with me or their society dean, they would have that initial conversation. Now, the problem with that is that it relied on students to self-identify, or sometimes what would happen is that if a faculty member noticed that there were issues with students clinically, or they just noticed, some of the things that were noted with Clarissa are very common to what we see happen when students enter that clinical environment. That might happen by faculty members reaching out to indicate that there was a challenge or issue that they're seeing. And typically that would happen through student affairs, where we have these society deans that kind of work again in tandem with students. And then we would refer them over to the Center for Accessible Education to get an initial consultation, gather documentation. But again, a lot of this, the onus and the burden fell on students to kind of do all of that legwork. So Grace, having you here as that point person is so essential. And I can't emphasize enough, having a designated DRP has been so critical to ensuring that students are getting that level of support, because I think there are a lot of students who, for the reasons we also mentioned in this case, were very reluctant. And again, I guess it should be emphasized that this also tends to be much more applicable to students who didn't previously receive accommodations or were newly diagnosed. So we saw that happen quite a bit for students who had a long history or experience self-advocating or navigating the process. They tended to feel much more comfortable navigating this. But yeah.
Yeah, and that's a very helpful description, Sue. So as she went through that process, we can kind of understand the kind of burdensome navigation the students have to take on when there isn't a centralized, disability provider or someone identified. So, one of the things you can immediately do to support a student like this is reach out to the schools that do have a centralized disability person that hopefully has the bandwidth, and time to really have a greater depth of knowledge in this area, and potentially use information like that to advocate for a resource like this for students. Okay. Sue, do you want to go over question 2?
Sure. All right. So this might seem like we're kind of going backwards, but we wanted to kind of go through, because this is super important, identifying what do you know about the situation based on kind of the key points we talked about with Clarissa, and what would you need to know, or what do you need to know to perhaps support the student? So I'll just open it up. And the first part of this question is really more just a recap and what stuck out to you about Clarissa's situation.
And just a reminder, you can raise your virtual Zoom hand and I will unmute you so you can talk. And then if you prefer to use the chat, we'll have Sue monitor the chat.
Yes, thank you, Grace.
So as disability resource providers, what were the things that stood out as we were, summarizing the student situation, both from a disability standpoint, a barrier standpoint, as well as maybe some personal characteristics of this student?
Yeah, and sorry for the confusion. I just saw this is just an aside about the start time. Moving forward, we'll make sure to make it clear when folks should join. Having development. That's an important one. Thanks. Is it Natalie? Yeah, that self-care piece is so important, right? She's having difficulty with self-care, and it tends to be kind of a how do you call it? It's almost like all these things are interrelated. So when a student isn't actually having protected time to go seek support for appointments or her well-being, that's going to have an impact on her clinical performance and academic performance as well. So that's a super important point that's often overlooked. Thank you.
All right, I see Sarah's got her hand up.
Yeah, I mean, what stands out a lot to me is the sort of struggling with executive function. It seems like that's really kind of hitting her in every different venue in terms of ability to focus. You know, when in the clinical space, she's having trouble navigating distractions. And then I think it's also bleeding into now her test prep, which is probably not abnormal for her, but I think with probably the increased demands in the clinical space, finding time and good study spaces to prepare for shelf exams. And I noticed this too with students that I'll work with when they transition from preclinical to the clinical spaces, just finding that time to study is so hard. And if you're not naturally good at time management, which it goes so much along with that executive function, it becomes really challenging to navigate like where to fit in study time, because these shelf exams are brutal. So
right, absolutely. Oh gosh, we're experiencing the same issue. The lack of study space too, Sarah, you mentioned, is so key, because students prior, I don't know that the transition is an easy one, right? For students who've been used to kind of that traditional study experience prior to entering rotations where they have, a lot of time and maybe the space when they're on campus to be able to study. So all of those things can compound and exacerbate the stressors and difficulties that students like Clarissa might experience. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and it's something too, and I think Sue definitely can concur. We see a lot of medical students struggling with executive functioning, and a lot, this is the first time they've really been challenged in this way, because the ability to self-accommodate usually relies on having the ability to build in additional time to get things done or to navigate. And med school is super fast paced, and there's a lot you have to do in a short period of time. And it's kind of removing that ability to self-accommodate sometimes. And that's also why we quite often see students for the first time seeking accommodations. All right, I see Tamara, you got your hand up again. You should be.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So one thing that stuck out for me, I'm big about looking at strengths and weaknesses. And so one of the strengths that I found in the case study for Clarissa was that in the small group setting, it stated that the group leader found that she was able to grasp knowledge, a decent amount of grasping the knowledge, and was good at looking at the whole picture, the big picture, which is a strength of hers. And so with that understanding, when we look at the areas that she has weakness in, we are able to kind of develop a better sense of how to better support her, as far as devising a plan of action with her in order to get her to reinforce a lot of the skills that she already has used to self-accommodate. So it's like building upon that strength in order to help her, successfully get through. And then lastly, what do you need to know? I found it interesting that even though I think it was an advisor had approached her about seeking out disability support services to get accommodations, but she was hesitant for various reasons, right? But one thing that is when we think about DEI, which is when we look at disability, we have to include that as a subpopulation of a marginalized group as well. So when we look at DEI and consider it from that standpoint, the question that I would like to know is, what is her background from a historical standpoint, because she may come from a culture or a background that really doesn't see the importance of going through a psychological assessment, because it may reveal other things that are taboo or, or not discussed.
Yeah, that is an absolutely excellent, observation. And it's something, I certainly see a lot in my position, and even in previous positions, students saying they were reluctant to connect to the disability office, because they didn't know where this was recorded and who would have access to that information. And there was a great deal of stigma, either from a family perspective or a cultural perspective, and even for students who might still be on parents' insurance and worrying about where that shows up, understanding the registration process, as they're trying to figure out some of those pieces can be a barrier for students in those situations. Anything else or anything in the chat, Sue?
Yeah, they're struggling financially, Kim. That's such a great point, and kind of building off of what Tamara's just said about looking at the structural inequities and the cultural factors, and just all those things that are playing into the barriers that students facing. On top of that, they're struggling financially, and so looking at the student from a holistic perspective is so important, and is something in my line of work we're always trying to figure out how we can help students in a more holistic way and not just look at it from one lens. And sometimes that also involves not only referring students out or providing resources, but doing warm handoffs and really looking at students in this holistic way. And something else mentioned by Tamara is like not necessarily focusing on the deficits, which I thought was so important, but also really coming from a strengths-based perspective, which I thought was a really great insight. Joanne mentions she wanted to know, how do you define timely manner in a clinical setting? And so when students are being evaluated, that's something at UCLA we've had to really drill down on with faculty evaluations, is when, there's definitely room for faculty development, obviously, as probably many of us acknowledge in this space, but, really drilling down on defining and kind of being clear on what are the standards and how are they being defined. That's a really great point.
Yeah, and that's a helpful point too, when the student is working with the disability resource provider as well, when we're saying a student might need some additional time to complete patient notes or to review patient information, quite often they want it to be to be a little bit more concrete, the site does. And so some of that, when a individual expresses concern over timely manner, we ask, how are we determining that? So if they, if they say it's 15 minutes, is that an average? Is that the absolute longest it can be? Because there might be some implication. If somebody goes beyond that, is it a situation where it's, just what they feel like they should be able to do at this point? Because the reality is, in practice, is it's obviously a range. Some people will do it really quickly. They're very efficient. They might have, assistants that help them with certain aspects of the process. And then others might take much longer. And so talking them through how that timely is defined. I see Joanne has her hand up. You should be able to talk.
All right. Sorry, I just wanted to add that came up for me in a occupational therapy with the notes and the statement of it needs to be done in a timely manner. And I think to your point, it's just really important that we have a conversation like, what does that mean? Maybe it means something to maybe the evaluator, but for the office, like do people take their work home and do their notes at home? Like all those questions I think need to be answered, because it's really easy to just say they have to be done in 15 minutes or whatever. And it's much harder to really get a sense of what's really in practice and for a particular office. And maybe they can't do notes after hours, but probably they can. And that, and I think that's where sometimes I've struggled with having those conversations, is that there's just sometimes a real resistance to, well, this is how I do it, or this is how we expect people to do it. And I think for this student, you know, really understanding, again, somebody said this, like what their compensatory strategies have been and how they've utilized them could really help engage in the conversation with the folks in the clinical setting to say, like, here's what we could do. Here's some strategies that we might be able to employ here.
Right. Partnering in the process with those folks. That's such an important point. Thanks for sharing. Joanne.
Yeah. And I think it's important, you know, to have individuals you can talk about, you know, or talk to in the field about, you know, what they've been doing and what accommodations have looked like. So you're coming in with a certain level of information, because this is going to be new territory for the faculty and the site as well. You know, so helping them lead through that. And I always try to prepare, whether it's the site director, the clerkship director, I prepare them for my process and why I'm asking questions. I was kind of smirking as you were explaining, Joanne, and walking people through that about like, how did we come up with 15 minutes? Because you feel like almost like that little kid, you know, at like the 3-year-old stage where every question is, but why, you know, and so I explained to them, like, part of my job is, you know, I'm an advocate for the equity process, but I also protect both the institution and the student. So anything that we determine, I have to document and I have to defend. So, you know, if they say, well, you know, that's the way we've always done it, and say, I can very much understand that. However, you know, if the Office of Civil Rights received a complaint, not that they will, you know, how would we respond to this? Because we always have to think from that perspective. And if we're seeing that other institutions are handling it in X, Y, and Z ways, can you help me understand why that isn't possible? You know, because of either the nature of our program, is it something about the particular site or rotation? You know, I really let them in kind of behind the curtain to understand my process, what I'm doing, and why I'm asking questions. So it doesn't seem like I'm just kind of contesting their knowledge or questioning them as a faculty member. You know, I very much, I'm certainly not, you know, an MD, you know, this is not my area of expertise, but my area of expertise is in understanding kind of the accommodation request process and determining reasonable accommodations.
Yeah, that's a great point, Grace, because it's not only trust building between faculty and students, it's trust building all around with folks who are actually working with students. To make sure that communication and the trust is there. And I'm seeing in the notes here, that's a great point, Sarah. It's funny. That's an interesting situation, because I was thinking, and to myself, one of the challenges is that there isn't sometimes consistency from site to site, and it's so much, you know, personality dependent or person dependent on how these things are defined. But you're bringing up an interesting additional element in the chat comment about, you know, the residencies are taking home notes all the time, but you know, for some reason students are being told, you know, that's not standard practice. So it's interesting to think about that GME UME continuum, and you know, what are the expectations we're setting. And you know, it's the first time I'm hearing it on the flip side. Usually it's going to be more challenging and difficult for students once they get into GME, which is the rationale for making a very stringent set of expectations for students to meet on the UME side. But it's interesting to think about how it might be, that's not always the case.
Yeah, that is, I mean, I don't know how common it is, but I know like at UCLA, our students all have specialty software on their computers, so they are able to use their personal device anywhere in the hospital to take notes, but they can also do it at home. So, you know, it allows them some flexibility. It allows them to find, you know, adaptive or ergonomic, you know, desks and seating if they need that. So we always ask, you know, what the differences are in those situations. And in that situation, they're still a student, you know, they're not held to the same expectations of a professional staff member. And most residents are considered professional staff members. All right. I'm going to move on to question 3. So, you know, while we are thinking about what do we still need to know to support this student and to address some of the concerns in medical school, how and where might we find new information that might lead to enhanced access and support for this student? again, I encourage people to just kind of share what they're thinking. We're all learning from one another, so there isn't a particular answer we're looking for. It's more just to kind of hash through and to be a learning environment for these situations.
Yeah, and my guess is that there are many of you with tons of experience and wisdom that you can bring to the table. So we're hoping, sharing of best practices and the time that we have, if you have insights to share. I love that. Thank you, Chelsea. Yes, Grace has been such a boon to UCLA. We're so happy to have her at BGS. Have I said that before? I think I sound like a broken record. Yes, consult and hire. I think, Grace, your time is limited, so we're not going to share your cell or anything. People like Grace. Let's put it that way.
Well, and one thing I will say too, the other kind of purpose of these types of sessions and debriefs and book clubs is to create a professional network. So I remember, when I was 26, I was brand new into a brand new, disability resource position, first professional position that I'd had. And it happened that the institution I was at had a medical school and a number of other health science programs, and just feeling out of my depth, and just being like, oh, I've made a terrible mistake. This is very different than a small liberal arts school, which was a little bit more straightforward. And the reality is, it's about creating networks and individuals that you can have open dialogue with. And again, like there's stuff that people will ask me and I'll be like, that's an excellent question. I don't know. I can tell you, and I'm an out loud processor, how I might approach it or what I might look into it. But then in my head, I always have like a list of people that I know are great to go to for certain types of, accommodations. We'll talk at the end about some resources you can use. But, another reason to really encourage is, although it might seem like I have a lot of the answers and, might feel like that in future weeks for other, chapters, I certainly don't. So that's why we really encourage you to share and talk a little bit more about, what you would do to immediately kind of support the student and kind of help them get that enhanced access. All right, Joanne. Perfect.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I did something. Sorry. I mean, the first thing that came to my mind when you asked, like, where would you find new information? I mean, to me, I think I'd start with the student to really understand a little bit more about their experience, and if there's any comparisons that we could kind of make with other things that they've done, to support their learning. So I think I would start there just to drill down a little deeper on some of the details of what their experience has been. And then I think where I'd probably find new information is I just think I'd want to know as much as I could about the clinical setting. Again, that maybe, diving a little deeper into the technical standards and really making sure I have all the information so that we can kind of come together and talk about what's possible. What can we do to support the students so that they can be successful? They've clearly demonstrated that they were able to do that in the preclinical setting, with the exams and I think that I would always keep in the back of my brain too that the disability word that we have, that the student is now carrying as part of her identity. I think that's an important thing to keep there because in the front, because it's new to this individual. Accommodations are new, like this is all a new environment. And I think it's just really important to keep that at the forefront and helping everyone kind of understand what's possible.
Wow, Joanne, that was so well articulated. And it's such a great point to center the voice and the perspective of the student and what they're having to go through in this whole transition. And that was a really interesting point, which I don't know if we highlighted in the key points, but that that this is a newly diagnosed student. She didn't actually have a diagnosis or know that she had any of these disabilities until she got to med school and struggled. So that just all of the huge transition mentally, psychologically, emotionally for the student is so important to keep in mind, and really centering that student's perspectives and voice. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely echo that. And I think it's important to know, even sometimes when students are a little bit more vocal in, in undergraduate space regarding having disabilities, being involved in groups like Nahm for mental health based disabilities, or in a student group for disabilities, there is this sense that once you get to graduate or professional school, and it's a misconception, but that you should have it figured out by then, or you made it to medical school, why aren't you able to thrive now? And so students, even though there's still a decent number registered, they're not nearly as vocal with one another sometimes. And so I'd say one of the reasons my position exists is there was a student group that was created that advocated for resources and kind of became that face of disability at the school, and said, we are here, we do, require supports in these areas. And here's where we're seeing access barriers that a student without a disability wouldn't have to navigate. So I think those are really important points about, integrating all these pieces, from an identity perspective. Anything in the chat, Sue?
Yeah, I'm looking, let's see here. Oh yeah, Daniel, thank you. Yes, okay, this is echoing, I think, what Joanne shared, but is getting new information from the student themselves, and to learn and prioritize their concerns, is the way to ultimately help them. And thank you so much, Daniel. That's so important. All right, I think we're ready for the next question. This is great. Thank you so much. And again, we want to draw from your collective wisdom and experience in this. So please feel free to share. So yeah, actually, and speaking of that, we just wanted to kind of ask you a question about your own institution. So, thinking about Clarissa and students like Clarissa, and if you've had experience with this, helping students transition into that clinical environment, how might you structure or how might the structure of your institution's processes, policies, and available resources help or hinder navigating a similar case? So when we think about where we are, what are some things that are already in place that might be helpful for someone like Clarissa? What are some things that might hinder someone like Clarissa and her challenges? Yeah, so we're seeing both sides. Thank you so much in the chat. I see Natalie, faculty who do not understand accommodations and disabilities. Oh, that's a big one. And obviously partnering with faculty development, folks involved in that whole process. It's an ongoing thing, but I know, Grace, you've done a lot of that, honestly, in one-to-one conversations, if we're being honest, but also in workshop settings. But that's a big one. And also, as mentioned earlier, just the fact that once you're in a clinical environment or students are in the clinical environment, just the variation in sites and the complexity of navigating different folks who might be working with a student at different sites and different clerkships. Oh yeah, Stephanie, I've never heard of health professions. Have a partner in health. Okay, yes, obviously it helps to have a partner in health professions who works with accessibility services. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say those collaborations with faculty and building those inroads are important.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I recognize as someone who came from positions where I was over everything, undergrad, grad, and professional programs, that's not always easily done, but, I think if you don't have a ton of bandwidth to really get to know the departments, to live and breathe it as somebody who's integrated might do, taking the opportunity to reach out every so often. I had a rotation where I would just check in with like a PT program and say, how are things going? This is who I am. Would love to, grab coffee or lunch with you sometime and just talk about, how we could connect and collaborate. Or I'd share articles and things like that with them from the listservs I was on. So, creating those partnerships can be something you can do. And, in a lot of different ways, even if you have limited bandwidth.
Absolutely. Sarah, I see you wrote in, ooh, that's an interesting angle we haven't discussed yet. And I know, Grace, you've had to navigate this with some students as well, which is, thinking about the option for a decelerated curriculum during the clerkship years. And Sarah mentions that some schools seem super against a decelerated clerkship because, it's kind of comes across to them or some faculty as being a fundamental alteration of the curriculum. And that's a really, really interesting and important point. I don't know if Grace, you want to speak to that. Sorry.
Sore subject. No, but this is a really common question. I think a lot of the perception in health science programs is part of what you were preparing the student for is kind of the fast pace, the amount of work that'll have to be done. And I hear productivity a lot. There's expectations about how many patients they see in a day, but like we talked about with in a timely fashion, that looks different in different rotations for different subspecialties, for different sites and types of sites, outpatient versus inpatient, surgery, and even within surgery, does the plastics versus oncology, versus ortho look the same? There's so many different kind of nuanced pieces to look at. We quite often question, what are we trying to teach the student at each kind of step or juncture or point along the way? And so one of the conversations, we've been having is, with our students that are in their transition to their clinical year, where they typically are in either a 4-week or 8-week rotation, and they're studying for their shelf exam during that entire time. And then, the last day of that rotation, that Friday, they have it off because they are taking their shelf exam. And so, in that situation, we're not just asking the student to learn what it's like to be on the clerkship, to do the work of that clerkship. We're also asking them to integrate all this knowledge, retain all this knowledge in not just a short-term cramming way, and retain that, because they're going to need it for the board exams. They're going to need it for the step exams, where if you really think about it, 4th year is really getting a better sense of what they're going to be going on, depending on your curriculum, what they're going to be doing in residency. They're just doing the work, each day. They're rotating through different specialties. It doesn't have the added kind of pressure of that kind of assessment that's happening all the way along. So having some of those conversations is helpful. I do think it's always helpful to go into those conversations with examples of what other schools are doing. That was helpful for me, especially, for anything in the UC system. We really look at what the other UC schools are doing, but we look at what all medical schools are doing and looking at the structure of their curriculum. And sometimes it's helpful to bring up those issues before you ever have a student that needs it, which is why we'll talk about resources later. The Coalition for Disability Access and Health Science Education has a phenomenal listserv. So you'll see somebody ask a question on there and it's like, ooh, that could definitely come up in our situation. It just hasn't yet. So that's an opportunity to share that with, clerkship directors or deans to say, what would this look like if we needed to do this? Let's think about this before there's ever someone kind of standing waiting, for the response for this question.
Thanks, Grace. Yeah, and I see a really interesting and very great suggestion from Kim. So one thing that might help is to be able to assign the student to a clinical time or location or place that might be beneficial to the student, depending on their accommodation needs. And maybe there's a time of day in which the student functions best, is best for their personal situation, whether it's travel time, work hours, etc. So thank you for sharing, Kim.
Yeah, that's an absolutely excellent point, and something, we'll talk about some of the questions that were at the end of the chapter, kind of the guiding questions for it, and we'll leave that as like kind of to go food for thought for you before we jump into questions. And one of those talks about, when do you start talking about clinical accommodations and the availability of it in the program, or does your program even talk about it at all? Because, some of these accommodations take kind of prep time to get in place, one of which is quite often, whether it's proximity placement or specific placement for rotations, we typically need to know that before the, I don't know how other schools do it, but we have a lottery for most of those that determines placement. So if we have to place a student, for instance, at the VA for a surgery rotation, because all of their surgeries tend to be scheduled, we know exactly the length of them, we know the availability, things like that, or the availability of resources. We need to know that before the lottery is run, because we would never bump another student, in order to facilitate accommodation. But if a student doesn't know that they need to connect with disability services, before that lottery is run, that puts them at a somewhat of a disadvantage, and it creates a more scrambling effect for the disability resource provider. Other thoughts?
Yeah, and we can address this later. I know with time, maybe we can go on to the next section and then come back to some of the questions that were submitted.
Yeah, and so I can go over, so like we said, these are kind of questions and guiding statements that were at the end of the chapter that we call like the to-go food for thought. So if you're thinking about some of the things we've talked about for this student case, and applying this to your institution, these are things we would kind of use as a way to start guiding conversations with individuals. So one, do you have an identified or specialized disability resource provider supporting your health science programs? If not, who does handle these requests? What's their position? Are they in an evaluative role? Do they have any kind of background in, disability services or accessibility, or vice versa? If they do have that background, what work have they had or experience in health sciences? Who's involved in the discussion about clinical accommodations? When you're going through the interactive process and determining what's reasonable, what's not, as the DRP, who are you bringing in to discuss the clinical accommodation, and how are you thinking about students' privacy, throughout that process? Does your program discuss clinical accommodations at the start of the program, maybe even in your admissions materials? Are we encouraging students to connect early to your disability office? How does your program make disability disclosure a safe and protected process? So what are we communicating to students about where this information is stored, who has access to it, and who is defined as a need to know? Continuing this, when students transition from the preclinical curriculum to clerkships, is there any process to reevaluate their needs for accommodations in the clinical environment? So this is something I've certainly heard in a couple different environments when there's low bandwidth for a disability provider, or in the community college setting, that there's this one and done meeting with the student. But the reality is things are going to change over time, both in terms of how the disability impacts the student, but also the environment the student is transitioning through. So making sure there's opportunities to connect with the student before they kind of make these big transitions. What might be included in the institution's plan to support all students in their clinical rotation? So regardless of disability status, what as an institution are we doing to support students that might struggle in that transition? How does your program proactively work with students to discern an academic struggle from a disability? And if they don't, how could they? And that's something I would say we were really lucky. Sue and I have a very close partnership. Her team is absolutely amazing. I would say they're my favorite people to meet with on campus. So I never mind how many times we do need to meet. But it's a nice way to connect students to disability services, especially if there's a faculty or society dean that's like, I think there's something more going on, but they've never disclosed a disability. How do I navigate this? By connecting them to Sue's team, and they can kind of discern, is this a fund of knowledge issue? Is this an approach issue? If it seems like it's something more, it's a sensitive way to make that connection to disability services. And then how approaches and resources, or how could your institution approach resources to support students with diverse backgrounds and identities? First generation students, low income students, or students from under-resourced backgrounds, LGBTQ students, or underrepresented students. And what steps can be taken to encourage all stakeholders, faculty, staff, admissions, etc., to embrace universal design and inclusive instructional methods, which can support students with and without disabilities? All right, Sue, do you want to talk about the book club website?
Yes, great. And I was just responding to Tamara's really interesting point from back when, so I'll let that chat, but if you wanted to add to that, or if anybody wants to add to that, these are such great points. I'm learning a lot myself. And yeah, so anyway, the book club website, I know that was a question. Oh, and accessing the recording. Yes, this is being recorded. TBD as to whether we'll share it. We're in discussion about, just the long-term plan. This is our first session. So we're going to debrief and talk about, whether these recordings will be shared out. But we will let you guys know, will everyone know. If so, probably will be linked in a place where you can access it through the website. And speaking of the website, just wanted to make sure you are all aware of where to access information about future sessions. And I'll throw in the chat the actual link. So I think someone mentioned that they had difficulty getting to it. So hopefully this one works. And yes, you can register. Is that right, Grace? You can register for future sessions. The facilitator names, the dates, the times will all be posted there. The next session, case 2, will be facilitated by Emily McGee and Samantha Schroff. That's going to be held on February 9th from 3:45 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we hope you can join us for that session. And in terms of purchasing the book, for those of you who aren't already aware, there is a link to purchase this book here, and also put that in the chat because I don't think it's hyperlinked on the actual, or I guess it just helps to have it in the chat. So the direct link to purchase it is right here. It's full of really great detailed they're based on actual cases, and it's not just for medical school scenarios, it's for health sciences in general. So you'll have cases that represent a range of students in different health science graduate programs. And it's really comprehensive. I highly recommend it. Of course, that might seem like I'm biased, but it's really been insightful to go through the cases myself. And yeah, you can see, and I'm sure your institution may also want to have a copy to distribute for faculty development and things like that. Yes, now I'm happy to share that link again. Was it for the book club? Yes, I'll do that just right now.
Yeah, and I know Dr. Meeks always encourages checking out to see if your library has it first, because if you can access it for free, her goal is to eventually have, almost everything that we're doing available for free, just to spread the impact. So check out your kind of internal library system first. We do want to touch on some references and resources. So certainly the AAMC has a series of webinars that are super helpful that cover a wide variety of topics, and they're absolutely free. You just have to register to have access to them. UCSF created some faculty training videos that are available on their website. There's connections to that on the Health Science Coalition website as well. And that's something, if you're interested in utilizing and want the direct kind of link and stuff like that, you can reach out to UCSF and they're happy to share that. That's why they created it. And I've used those trainings as part of our required yearly faculty training. The Docs with Disabilities podcast is certainly something we like to promote. So Dr. Meeks and Dr. Poulos interview health science providers with disabilities and a wide variety of disabilities, and talk about kind of their firsthand experiences. They also have a brand new mini podcast that's in 15 minutes or less, reviews the current research in this area. For the Docs with Disabilities website has all the initiatives that fall under the Docs with Disabilities work, which includes the DRP Academy that I talked about. You can also just click the initiative button on that site, and that's where the book club link will be found. We like to highlight the Coalition for Disability Access and Health Science Education. As I mentioned, their organization has a great listserv that offers an opportunity to connect with individuals and gain kind of that mentorship that you might be looking for. And we like to thank the Association on Higher Education and Disability, or AHEAD, for being our partner and co-sponsor and working with us today. So now we will turn it over for questions. I know we have about 6 minutes. So for those that just had other things they wanted to ask that weren't directly related to the case, or if they have things that popped up after the case, please feel free.
And I'm just trying to respond to all of the questions and awesome suggestions for how to access the book. Thank you for the best practice suggestions. I love their interlibrary loan, Daniel mentions, and just various ways folks are getting their hands on the book. And I've also just reposted the link to the website where you can register. And I do believe there was a question that was raised about, do you have to register for each session separately? I do believe so. Grace, I don't know if you want to confirm or add on to that.
Yes, yeah, they ask that you confirm for each so they get a sense of how many participants for each session. And I also see a question in the question and answer from Tamara. It says, in a community college setting where partnerships with local medical facilities for clinical practice occurs, how does accommodations apply? Is the higher education institution or the student responsible to request accommodations from that clinical site directly? The fine line between academic setting versus clinical. So that's an excellent question, and one that I think comes up all the time, and something that a lot of us in disability resource provision struggle with is this third party relationship management. And so what guidance I always follow is kind of follow the money. So if that student is at that clinical site as part of their nursing program, their occupational therapy assistant program, they're a student first, they're not an employee of that clinical site. So as such, the disability resource provider at that institution needs to be the one navigating that process. Similarly, it can be tricky if a site pushes back on an accommodation or is reluctant, because the expectation is that if it's a reasonable accommodation and we've done our work, we've maybe put it up on the coalition listserv, people said, yes, this is really common, this is how you do it. If the site still is reluctant, we certainly still have to find a site for that student, but the expectation is we wouldn't partner with someone who engages in discriminatory behavior towards a student with a disability. Now, I also know we don't want to lose clinical sites, especially with the pandemic, it's been more challenging to get sites. There's a lot of competition, but it's important to do some kind of faculty development and partnership development with the sites that you're working with about what is common, what to expect. Again, sometimes I would, create these connections there, and I would send them articles from the listserv, or I would invite them to join our listserv, because the institutional cost, I think, is like $185. So adding, our point person or liaison from that site could be helpful in them becoming more aware of what's common in disability.
Grace, I love this question. And that is, who was it that asked it? What was your journey to your getting to your position? Chelsea, yes, Chelsea Ross asked.
It's a very interesting one, I feel like. So I think, the short version is, my undergrad's in psychology. I had like a quarter life crisis and was like, I don't know if I want to go into special education or I want to go into clinical psychology. And I kind of lucked into this higher education program. Whoever wrote the promotional materials for that did a great job, because all the questions, I don't remember what they were, but it was like, do you like X? Do you like Y? And I'm like, I do. I definitely do. And so I signed up and I landed in the Learning Center at Baldwin Wallace University, which was right across from the disability service person, and listening to what she did every day. At the time, I was working in direct care facilities with at-risk youth, in residential treatment facilities. It was the perfect combination of my interest in kind of the education piece, the academic piece, as well as, kind of looping in my psychology background and my mental health background. So even though my program was designed to just get you a job in higher ed and then work your way to where you want to be, I held out for a disability service position at Case. And then it just so happens the position I took over at Case was formerly held by Dr. Lisa Meeks. So when I called her for a Kurzweil password, I ended up joining the board of the Coalition for Disability Access in Health Sciences, and was pulled into some research and some books. And so, there I really want to emphasize that mentorship and connection goes a really long way in this area. And, I'm very big on paying that forward. So if anyone does have questions, my information can be found on the website for UCLA, and CIE sites. I'm always happy to connect with individual and pay that forward, that guidance.
Yeah, lots of questions about registering for the next one, which is awesome. I'm so glad there's an interest in that. So the series is on the website, and I put it, and thank you, Emily, as well, for posting the link to the website, and there's separate RSVP links for every session. So just to make sure to click on those links. If anyone's still having trouble, just let us know. But hopefully that's all clear. Any other questions for us? And we're almost at time. This is almost perfectly timed. Good job, Grace.
Yeah, so I just want to thank Docs with Disabilities Initiative again. A huge thank you to AHEAD for everything that you do to help us facilitate these sessions, and a huge thank you to all of you for coming and participating and finding time in your very packed days. We hope to see you at the future ones.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Yeah.